Welcome back, everyone. Well, a few days ago, we took a look at Geography by Jeff, redrawing the U.S. state borders, and that was received really well. We had some amazing conversations going on in the comment section. Everyone took my lead and made it very lighthearted and laid claims for their own state, either to accept or reject the suggestions that were made. So today we're going to take a look at another one. This is fixing Europe's borders, and then in parentheses, and making everyone upset. This one's by general knowledge. And likewise, I'm going to ask, especially for the people who live in the places that are discussed in this video, I'm going to ask you, number one, please don't take it too seriously. But number two, I want to hear your thoughts. I'm going to offer my own commentary and observations on all of this, but I don't live there. I don't know the people of these places other than maybe a few friends and maybe a few days or weeks that I've spent in some of these places. So I'm hardly an authority on whether or not, for example, Ireland should be reunified or Yugoslavia should exist or whatever it might be. So I want to hear from you, the people who live in these places. Use the comment section below. This will be an entertaining but also informative opportunity for us to talk about how these countries came to be in the first place and whether they are the best versions of themselves. The link's in the description if you want to check it out, as well as all of General Knowledge's other stuff without my commentary. Let's dive in. Oh my. This is going to be interesting. You divide up Germany and the UK.
The comments on this video are going to be fun, huh? I think it's going to be a record of about 10 to 12 different countries that are going to be mad at me. A couple weeks ago, I saw this video by Geography by Jeff.
He actually got inspired by the very video that led me to want to look at this one.
He redesigned the state borders of the United States. It's a great video. You should definitely go watch it. And it's from where I drew inspiration, this idea to do the same thing, but instead for Europe. So let's redesign Europe's borders. Again, remember, this isn't to be taken super seriously. I'm not advocating for any country to disappear and not seriously defending annexations or losses of territory.
The fact that we even have to say that sort of thing is just an indication of where we are as a culture. And I understand we have all different cultures, but collectively, as an internet culture, people get so offended and get so worked up over stuff that was never meant to be taken that seriously. And honestly, just in life in general, this is just me offering my own little bit of advice here. Man, don't take yourself or anybody else too seriously. That is a miserable way to live. The number of people that I see getting worked up and angry over stuff that really just does not affect them in any major way. I'm not saying you shouldn't be passionate and forceful about things that matter. But somebody making a video about what they think should be done with Europe's borders as kind of a thought experiment is not something that is going to hurt your life in any way. So don't take it seriously. All right.
Start out west and then travel east. We're going to begin with Portugal. Portugal is one of the most well-defined nation states in the world.
That's true. And it's existed with relatively the same border for a long time.
Am I saying this because I'm Portuguese and I'm biased? A little bit, but it is true. The truth is, Portugal is often presented as a perfect example of a nation state, along with countries like Japan, Poland, Greece, or Iceland, countries where a single ethnic group is dominant, and contrasting with places like Canada or Belgium, where essentially different nations exist within the borders of the single country. Because of that, these perfect nation states are less likely to fall apart or break apart. And that's the reason why I think Portugal wouldn't lose any territory. It also has had the same border since like 1243.
All excellent points. And that's something I guess I've really not taken the time to think about too much, is that we have very different kinds of nations that exist. And you see throughout history, for example, Germany, even going up through World War II, attempting to reunite people with common language and sometimes common heritage. You saw that all through the 19th century, where you had all those German states trying to decide how they were going to form together. So having a similar culture, language, heritage, religion does make it much easier to kind of be a cohesive unit.
I did, however, think it would be interesting to add Galicia to Portugal.
Ah.
This is based around a small movement called reintegrationism, a linguistic movement in Galicia that advocates for the recognition of Galician and varieties of the Portuguese language as a single language. Galician is, in fact, very similar to Portuguese, arguably more similar than it is to Spanish. And Portugal emerged from Galicia when it was first created, sort of. In addition, a small independence movement exists within Galicia too, and a potential success in breaking away from Spain might be followed by an integration with their language brothers of Portugal, perhaps with a status of an autonomous region like the Portuguese archipelagos of the Azores and Madeira.
That actually all seems perfectly reasonable to me, and I imagine it's going to be one of the more reasonable ones we're going to talk about.
Oh, and also we could finally regain Olivença. It is legally Portuguese after all, despite being occupied and ruled by the Spanish. And then we have Spain, precisely. Just like Galicia, other Spanish regions have independence movements too. The strongest ones, and I would say the only serious ones that have a real chance of succeeding, are the Basque country and Catalonia. So in this map, I decided to give independence to those two new countries that Europe would have. I also thought, hey, what if the Balearic Islands got independence too? They're of course too small to be self-sustaining as a country, and they don't have any independence movement that I...
That's an area you don't hear much about, especially given the location that they are there in the Mediterranean.
I'm aware of, but they do have a lot of tourism, and they could potentially take advantage of conditions that other small island nations do too, perhaps becoming a tax haven and a fellow microstate like Monaco and Andorra, which, by the way, in this scenario, I think would continue existing too. To make up for these losses, I think it would make sense for Spain to finally re-annex Gibraltar. I mean, come on.
England, the UK is like, over our dead bodies.
Colonial times are over. Why do you have this place in the middle of the Mediterranean? It doesn't make much sense. Now, as you may notice on the map, part of the claimed Basque country and Catalonian territories reach into France. So they would lose a bit of territory there. Let's see what else would change for them. First, the island of Corsica, which is now part of France. Corsica is French today, but it used to be Italian before, and it also had...
Yeah, so it was Italian right around the time Napoleon was born there, and Napoleon was of Italian descent. 1769-ish, it becomes part of France. So, I mean, it's been French for a long, long time, but I would guess that a lot of people there are still ethnically Italian.
As a small independence movement, which used to be bigger, its economy and culture are similar to that of southern Italy, so I think it would make sense for it to join its southern brother of Sardinia and become Southern Italian. And by the way, in this map, I also divided Italy in two separate countries, North and South. Northern and Southern Italian cultures are a little similar, but they're also tremendously different in other aspects.
And these, when we get into some of these, what are relatively new nations like Italy, because Italy is a relatively new nation. I mean, when you're a lot newer than the United States, you're a new nation. In terms of your political entity, obviously their history goes back much longer. But, you know, Italy was all these different smaller states, and they had different dialects and different cultures and different economies. And I could see that kind of thing happening.
They have different heritage, economies, the north being urbanized and industrial, and the south being more rural and focused on agriculture and tourism. You could even argue that languages tend to be different depending on where you are, because Italy has so many regional dialects that are...
Yeah, and we talk about dialects. I understand that in some places the dialects are so distinct that they're often difficult to understand for one another, or they sound like different languages. And I get that. You know, to a non-English speaker, this is the example I always use. If you're talking to somebody from South Carolina in the United States, and then you talk to somebody from the Highlands of Scotland, they're both speaking English. Doesn't mean it sounds the same. In fact, you might have a difficult time understanding each other, even though you're both speaking English in that scenario. When I go to the Netherlands, and I hear people in the Netherlands speaking Dutch, it sounds very German to me, which makes sense. Dutch is a Germanic language. But then I go to Flanders in Belgium and hear Flemish, which is a dialect of Dutch. It sounds like a completely different language to me. And so different dialects of Italian can sound very distinctly different.
Completely different from each other. One good example of the different heritage is the percentage of blonde people in northern Italy versus the south. Consequence of the north's connections with different parts of Europe throughout its history, including Germany, Austria, and Scandinavia, where light hair is more common. So I think dividing the two into their own countries could potentially make sense, while San Marino and the Vatican would remain independent in this scenario. But now let's go back to France and see what else would change for them. As I mentioned before, France is another good example of a perfect nation state.
Yeah.
So apart from losing Corsica to Italy, the only two other changes I thought of were the annexation of the southern half of Belgium, Wallonia, where the population speaks French and is arguably a part of French culture.
And let's be fair, Belgium's just a made-up country anyway, right? No offense to our Belgian friends, but Belgium's pretty new, and it's kind of created as this buffer state between these other major powers.
Well as the potential loss of Brittany.
Brittany.
Brittany differs from the rest of France in the sense that it has a stronger Celtic heritage. Brittany is in fact considered to be one of the 6 Celtic nations, along with Cornwall, Ireland, the Isle of Man, Scotland, and Wales. And in fact, if you notice a little further north, I also added Cornwall and the Isle of Man as being independent.
Now, I will say this, if you're going to give France Wallonia, you have to give Germany back Alsace. Just saying.
Throughout the 20th century, especially at the start of it, there were some movements asking for independence or at least greater autonomy for Brittany within France. While this movement has died out a little in the current century, there are still remnants of it. Breton cultural nationalism includes an important linguistic component, with Breton and Gallo speakers still seeking equality with French within the country.
So I've never been to that part of France. I've been to a lot of northern France, but I haven't been to the western part. I'm very curious to know more about that region and what it's like there, and if it feels different than France. For anybody who's been there or who might live there, let me know.
So an independent Brittany in the context of a fully redrawn Europe in a scenario like this wouldn't be that crazy. Now, since I mentioned the Celtic nations that are today part of the UK on the map, let's take a look at those next. In a scenario like this, where we're trying to assign territories based on different local cultures and ethnicities or nations, I think a breakup of the United Kingdom would be inevitable. In this case, England would stand alone, while Cornwall, Wales, Scotland, and the Isle of Man would go off on their own as new countries, while Northern Ireland would be annexed by the Republic of Ireland and exist together.
Bring back Wessex.
I mean, half of Scotland still wants independence today, the numbers in Wales are surprisingly going up too, and the Catholic population of Northern Ireland is taking over, making a reunification just a matter of time.
I don't know if I agree about the reunification being a matter of time, and obviously the week I spent in Ireland is hardly a substitute for being an expert on this subject, and I would love to hear from our Irish friends. I know we have a lot of folks in Ireland, both the Republic and also Northern Ireland. I don't think it's quite that simple. I think that you have Catholics and Protestants who kind of are mixed on these topics these days. And the impression I got in talking to people both in Belfast and in Dublin about this was that everybody was pretty content with how things are. And the agreement that's in place from the Good Friday Agreement, that at least the people I talked to were all perfectly fine with that agreement on both sides of the issue. That agreement basically says that if there's going to be reunification, it'll be because the counties in Northern Ireland are the ones who initiate it. So is it possible? Yeah, but I don't think it's quite as simple as it sounds.
I also added a tiny little detail with the Orkney Islands of Scotland
Orkney!
joining Norway.
Oh, I love Orkney. Is such a cool place. It's got like this Viking vibe, and you've got like a way better display of standing stones than even Stonehenge, and you can walk right up to them and touch them. You've got Scar Bray there. You've got Scapa Flow, where you had all these German ships that got sunk, and where these ships were intentionally sunk by the British to block the channels from U-boats. Really cool stuff.
Are often discontent with the British and Scottish government, and they are very often threatened to ask to be integrated within Norway and first declare independence to be able to do it. Why Norway? Well, Orkney was actually colonized and later annexed by the Kingdom of Norway in 875 and settled by the Norsemen. It was only in 1472 that Scotland, following the failure to pay a dowry promised to James III of Scotland by the family of his bride, Margaret of Denmark, annexed
Stuarts.
the island. So, hey, if they want to be Norwegian, why not make them Norwegian in this sort of crazy scenario that we're building? For the rest of Scandinavia, I didn't really think of many changes that could take place. I think Denmark recovering Schleswig-Holstein from Germany would make a little sense in this scenario.
So now we're going back to the middle of the 19th century where you have the Schleswig-Holstein Wars, and that actually makes a lot of sense too.
It was theirs for a long time, and part of the population there is still Danish. I think Finland could potentially recover some territory it historically lost to Russia, and perhaps the Sami people, common throughout the north of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, could achieve independence as their own fully sovereign state too, and plus the re-annexation of the Åland archipelago into Sweden as well. Going back to the west, we can take a look at what the Netherlands would look like and what changes would take place. Since we attributed southern Belgium or Wallonia to France, I think it only makes sense that we would give northern Belgium, Flanders, to the Netherlands. Flemish people are culturally and linguistically kind of Dutch already, so
kind of Dutch. It does sound really different to me than Dutch. I'm curious, and I've asked my Dutch friends this before, but anybody who's watching who's in the Netherlands or in Flanders, how easy is it for you to communicate with people? I mean, is there a big language barrier in terms of certain words or anything like that have different meaning?
From independence for both parts of Belgium, I think this type of territorial redistribution would make sense. The small border regions that are majority German could be given to the Germans too, and perhaps the capital of Brussels, being so multicultural to begin with, due to being the European Union's capital, could become its own city-state, sort of. That would be interesting to see.
Interesting indeed.
In the scenario, Belgium as a country would disappear completely off the map. I think Isaro Productions would be very upset at that. While Luxembourg also presents a kind of mix between French and German, it has very much developed its own identity, so independence would make sense even in this scenario, unless we assigned it to Portugal because of all the Portuguese immigrants that they have. Do you think that's too biased? Maybe.
A little bit.
Actually,
that's okay,
speaking of Luxembourg's territory, did you know that it used to be way bigger than being partitioned by its neighbors? I think that's a cool video topic on its own, you know, how Luxembourg used to be bigger and then it got smaller. If you want, I can do a full video on it. Switzerland is another case where no changes would occur.
Yeah, Switzerland has been its own thing for such a long time.
Perfect example of a nation state too. While language differences do exist with part of the country speaking French, the other speaking Germany, and part of it Romansh, a common Swiss identity does exist. At most, they could gain territory by annexing Liechtenstein, a country whose existence is quite odd. They are already in a custom and monetary union with Switzerland today, so I think a political one could make sense too. And now let's move to Germany and Austria.
Give them Alsace and Lorraine.
Reunified at the end of World War II, a lot of differences between East and West Germany remain today. The East is either Protestant or agnostic, while the East and South especially are Catholic.
I was going to say, one thing that would probably make sense to me would be link Bavaria and Austria together. They're very culturally similar, same language.
In fact, almost every indicator shows us how the two sides of the country are different. They even vote vastly different in elections, so why not assume these differences and accept that maybe they could be their own two separate countries?
They were. I mean, this is one of the examples here where you're going back to what existed in my lifetime. I mean, I was in high school when Germany reunified, or maybe 8th grade. It was basically right when I was starting high school. So East and West Germany were very much a thing for my childhood.
In this case, Berlin would be fully inside the East. West Germany could then exist on its own, while the South, being more predominantly Roman Catholic, could potentially unite with Austria.
There you go.
Despite having its own identity, Austrians are still speaking German and share a lot of common values, cultural heritage, and history with Germans, especially those in the South. So
there's a lot of Celtic heritage in Austria and in Bavaria. I agree with this 100%. And I'm going to revisit this idea after I get to spend some time in what is now East Germany, as I'm going to be doing, because we've got our upcoming tour at the end of April, going to be in Berlin, Dresden, and then heading down into Prague and Bratislava. before we head to Vienna. So going to be spending a lot of time in this region here. So I'll have a better understanding of all of this once I do that. But Bavaria in Austria did feel very similar to me.
So in this scenario, we would have 3 Germanys: West Germany, East Germany, and South Germany, which would include Austria. We could potentially assign East Germany some more territory within Poland. In fact, the old borders
Make
of the
Prussia
German
great
Empire
again
are still visible in many cultural and political differences within Poland today.
I say if we do that, we don't call it East Germany, we call it Prussia. Go back to that. Even though it wouldn't be all of Prussia, it would be a good chunk of it.
While those differences are still visible, actual German people living there have been moved into Germany's current borders at the end of World War II. So in this case, Poland would be another country with no changes to its territory. A lot of people maybe would say that they should annex Kaliningrad from Russia, but I have another plan for that.
Merge them with Lithuania.
The Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I think Russian Kaliningrad could be annexed by Lithuania, which could then join its northern neighbors of Estonia and Latvia to form a united Baltic duchy. This was actually proposed to be created at the end of World War I. In that case, it would kind of be a German puppet state, and it wouldn't include Lithuania, only Estonia and Latvia. It ended up not happening because then Germany lost the war on the Western Front. But in modern times, when threats from the east become higher and higher, I think it would make sense for these 3 nations to unite into one confederation to increase their strength.
I was going to say, this is an example of, you have different reasons why nations form. We talked earlier about the strength of common culture and heritage, language, things like that. But another reason why why nations form is strategic advantages. One of the reasons why Belgium was formed was because of strategic advantages for the other countries that were involved in forming it. So yeah, that's a scenario where there's strength in numbers, there's strength in unifying, even though there may be differences.
Speaking of the East, I think Belarus's annexation into Russia would be inevitable.
Might as well.
They are arguably a de facto Russian puppet state today,
Totally.
so this wouldn't bring much change. Now, to wrap things up for this video, let's move on to the Balkans, which is probably going to be the most problematic part of the video. The annexation of Moldova by Romania is, I think, only logical, and I think the less problematic. Most Moldovans are Romanian already.
Right.
I mean, the Moldovan president and opposition leader are both Romanians, and Moldova shares a history and cultural heritage within Romania too. It would be a good way for Moldova to be safe of external threats by automatically joining the EU and NATO, and I think both sides would be happy with this situation. In contrast with this territory gained by Romania, the country would also lose a little bit of territory on the border with Hungary. After World War I, the Treaty of Trianon left thousands of Hungarians outside of Hungary's borders by unfairly reducing their territory too much. While the idea of a greater Hungary is crazy, I think it would be fair for these Hungarians to get to live within Hungary, and so a slightly larger Hungary would exist, taking up parts of Romania and a little bit of Slovakia.
Makes sense.
Other than that, Slovakia would remain the same, as would Czechia. Slovenia would also see no changes, the same as Croatia and Montenegro. But Bosnia, Serbia, and Albania would. I think the breakaway of Republika Srpska from Bosnia is sadly inevitable, and its annexation by Serbia proper would follow, expanding the territory of the country.
See, this is a part of the world I don't know nearly enough about. I remember the days of Yugoslavia, which is the South Slavs, and then the breakup of Yugoslavia in the aftermath of the Cold War. There's so many complicated language and religion and political issues going on here. There's probably no easy solution to it.
The territory gain would perhaps make them more accepting of Kosovo breaking away and potentially joining Albania to consolidate its separation from Serbia. For Bulgaria and North Macedonia, I think no changes would be needed either. And finally, to make the most people mad, what if Greece took over European Turkey? The annexation of East Thrace was a Greek goal until the start of the 20th century.
Oh, wow.
The idea of
that never happened, but interesting.
Old capital of Istanbul, for them Constantinople, was then abandoned as it was deemed as unrealistic, which...
I mean, the only way that would even be a consideration is if Istanbul was excluded from that annexation.
Was, and to be honest, still very much is. But again, these are just hypotheticals to make us reflect a little bit on the borders that Europe has today and how they could or couldn't potentially change.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I like this kind of a thought experiment, for the same reason that I like doing alternate history scenarios, is because by looking at alternate history, it causes us to take a more critical look at what actually happened so that we can evaluate the importance of events as they unfolded by saying, well, what if this event changed? How different would the world look? And that shows us how important that event potentially was as it unfolded. Same thing with these borders. By looking at what could happen, it helps us better understand what did happen and what kind of fuels who those countries are and what their identity is.
So a Greek annexation of East Thrace would really clean up the look of Europe's borders over on this side of the continent. But what do you think? I doubt anyone will fully agree with all of these. Even if you agree with some, it's very likely you'll disagree with your country's changes, which I understand. I think I only agree with Portugal because we're only gaining territory and not actually losing any of it. But let me know in the comments.
All right, that was good. I enjoyed that. And I love that he didn't take himself seriously and he acknowledged his own bias and the whole thing. Awesome. I really enjoyed that a lot. I think he did a great job with that video. And I've enjoyed a lot of his content over time, and we'll definitely take a look at more. So if you have an idea, a suggestion for something you'd like me to take a look at, either on general knowledge or somewhere else, or you just want to talk about everything we just discussed, especially if you live in one of those places, let me hear from you in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.